for program improvement. As has been mentioned, I direct the National Reporting System Support Project, which has been going on now for almost 20 years, working closely with state staff on data issues, national reporting system issues, recently with WIOA indicators. So I work closely with the Department of Education on developing indicators and putting all the requirements in place. And also, most of what we do is training on data quality and data use. So today I'm going to run through a presentation that gives you an overview of using data, why you'd want to use data, and how we use it, and reasons people don't use data, so the barriers that there are, and how to overcome them. We'll do a little discussion about data quality because, of course, if you're going to use data, you got to have good quality data, otherwise it's going to be misleading. And then I'm going to give you a little practice to look at your own data and your state data, specifically your NRS tables, and show you what you can see there. And then we'll talk about the next steps, which will be a follow-up we'll be doing in the next month in the state conference in Las Vegas.
I wonder if it's going to my other.
It's a pretty complex. Yeah, so it is a little complicated topic, and so I can't really do it in depth. And I know probably like any adult ed class, there's different levels of understanding about data. Some with maybe you don't ever use data at all, and some you're expert at. So I'll try to cover it in an interesting way that it will be applicable to everybody. And we'll be doing more of this, as I said, next month in the state conference. We're in a data-driven world. It seems like everywhere you look, you have to present data. When I started doing this work almost 20 years ago, it was an unusual thing to do data, and there was a lot of even hostility toward it. Now, I think we're all used to it. We all have to provide data. We know it's part of our life. We're always taking surveys and asked to do so. And particularly for publicly funded programs, there's a lot of scrutiny to demonstrate your results and to show you're doing well. And that's pretty common now for just about every program. And particularly with education, that was one of the first programs to have to provide data. You might remember things like No Child Left Behind and other demands to show test scores and improve performance among states. We certainly had the NRS since 2000, so that's been going on. And now WIOA has increased that even more, and states also have their own requirements for data. And we even have performance targets now. So data is very much part of our world nowadays. At the federal level, where I mostly work, I can assure you that data is really, really critical. In fact, right now, in the last week, the different partners, the WIOA partners, Department of Labor and Department of Education, have been looking on the latest data submission and comparing results and seeing what's weak and strong. So it's very important right now for federal accountability. It supports our funding. In the past, it has been scrutiny by Congress and other agencies, but is adult ed worth its money that we're being put into it? And at the federal level, by presenting the data and showing our performance, they're able to provide funding for us. So it's been a very useful and very powerful tool for us. May not be entirely visible when you get down to the state and local level, but I can assure you at the national level, its data are quite scrutinized quite closely. Another thing about data is it gives a program an identity in the sense that you can show what you do. So people that maybe don't know adult ed, for example, you can say, well, here's what we do in adult ed, and here's what's unusual about us. We promote basic skills, we help people get jobs, etc., and you can show that with data. And of course, we're required to meet performance standards now. Your state, Nevada, like every other state, has requirements to meet certain levels of performance at every level. And at the federal office as well, the adult ed program is required to demonstrate to OMB, the watchdog agency for all data collection and programs, Office of Management and Budget, requires every program to present their indicators every year to show that their programs are effective. So there's even another level. So data is really used to identify policies and programs that work and support claims for improvement. So if you're trying to show, well, adulthood really is effective, we can have that data. And if it's successful, again, we can show, or if you need more funding, you can also use it to show the lack of coverage, or some people aren't getting the performance or coverage they need. So that's how we're using it at the federal level. Another thing they do at the federal level is look at national and state trends. In fact, we just, AIR, as a contractor to do the data analysis, we've just done some look at some trends for recent years, looking at enrollment and which groups of students do better than others, and which states are performing better. Every year, the Department of Education negotiates a performance target with every state and uses that to evaluate state performance. And we also report to Congress every year with our data. So the data that you're collecting really are used. Now, of course, that's not the only use of data, and I hope one of my aims in this presentation is to demonstrate the value of data at other levels. So it's not just used for federal level, but you can use it at your state, and I'm sure your state does do that to identify areas for improvement, to measure the effectiveness of your local programs, much like we do at the federal level, and helps identify what's making a difference, what's getting results, and if there's issues, helps identify really, with some digging, you can identify problems. And of course, you'll be hearing another webinar next week by my colleague, Amanda Duffy, who will talk about local uses of data and how you can use them at the local level and even at the classroom level. You can look at enrollment trends, how your students are progressing through test scores or measurable skill gains. You can look even at specific classes and teachers if you're able to drill down that and see what are the effective classes both for attendance and outcomes, and also what classes are doing well and which need assistance. So if data are so useful and wonderful to use, why doesn't everybody use it? And here's just a few of some of the reasons why it's difficult to get people to use data. Many people are uncomfortable with it for various reasons. And here's three that I've noticed in my work. There are justifiable fears in using data, I think. Often data are used, people perceive it used against you, particularly in education. It's like, oh, this school's not doing well, these students aren't doing the way they should be. And it's often used by those who have an agenda or vendetta, perhaps, to look in a negative way, to make you look bad. It can be used out of context. There's the old adage that there's lies, and damn lies from statistics. And so, used out of context, it can be misleading. And sometimes people know their data are not very good and really shouldn't be being used. Another set of reasons have to do with your norms for using data. I mean, if you're not used to using that, if your program doesn't really pay attention to data, you're not going to be able to use it. If you think it's a waste of time, if you're only using it for reporting purposes, just to fill out forms, or if you don't really know how to use data, you're not going to want to use it, not be motivated to use it. And same way, if you can't get your data, and this has to do with structural barriers, you can't use it. So if you're able to put data in your system, for example, but not get reports out, you can't use the data, so you're not going to use it, or you can't get it in the form you need it. And other things that structural barriers against using data are the data aren't timely. So if you're not entering it in a timely way, if it's last year's data, last month's data, it might not be useful to you, and also it takes time. And in adult ed programs are very stretched with resources and staff. So these are all barriers that can be overcome, but they're some of the reasons why we don't use data. So let me just look a little bit more closely at that and how we can overcome some of these barriers. The first thing we call technical barriers, which have to do with your database. And there's different levels of access you can have to your data. If it's system that really has no access or very few ways you can get your data out, that's the worst possible world. Another way is that you have to go through your state or another person to get the data. That makes it a little more difficult because it's not timely. The best way to do it is if you just can run a report and go right on and get your report. And I believe you can do that for some of your reports with your system in Nevada. Another thing you need to have is timely data, which speaks to entering your data in a regular basis and not letting it get behind. And then also having the reports you need. If you're able to go and pull down from a menu or define a report you need. So all of these things, if your database isn't able to do that, is what you need to get them to do it. The other thing is data collection is not an easy thing to do, and it's not something that's a priority a lot of times. So you want to have staff that's their job, or at least one of their jobs, to collect the data and perhaps analyze it. You've got to all be collecting it the same way with common measures and definitions. I think that's easier now under WIOA since we have common definitions, which we haven't in the past, and common forms and common ways you're entering the data and collecting the data. It's very easy to have errors with data checking, with data entry. So you need to have systematic error checking, run reports, or people looking at the data, and really staff have to be trained. So it's you can't just set up a system and say, go ahead, let's enter the data and go ahead and do it. You've got to have these 5 things really to get good data. The other thing that promotes data use is having leadership at your state and your program, and I think this webinar, for example, is an example of how your state really does value data and the use of data. And when that tone is set, it tends to promote data use, and particularly at your local level too, if your local staff is doing that, looking at data regularly, getting meetings around data, getting ideas about what's working and what's not, and discussing your results. I know some programs that do that on a regular basis, and that helps people get more invested in data, see the power of data, and pay more attention to it, which results in better quality. We even have, we've promoted developing communities of practice around data, and some states do that. We did a training on that a few years ago if you're interested in looking at that. And of course, attitudes have a great deal of to do with collecting data, particularly at the programmatic level. Here's just some common attitudes you can have that people have that are sort of negative. I don't have time. We know our data is good. We have a good system. We don't need to check it. I'll let someone else do it. I don't have time. I don't know what I'm going to I don't have the data. I'll just make it up. Who even cares? No one pays attention anyway. So these are all negative attitudes that sometimes come around data that we want to dispel. Okay, so and we do that by using data and finding it useful. So I have a little poll I'd like you to do, and think about those 3 areas: technical issues, that is, how does your data system work? Does it allow you access to data? Do you have enough support at your local and state level? And do you have any attitude issues in your program? So just an anonymous poll here. If you want to rate on scale of 1 to 3, it's not an issue, you need to improve, or it's a serious problem. Or just out of curiosity to see, and before we move ahead, why don't you answer this poll? Okay, I'll give you a few more minutes. Okay, so it's looking like you don't have too much of an issue on leadership or not so much on your data system either, or doing pretty well then. Need to improve, about 40% of you, a little bit less, saying you'd like to have better technical, maybe technical issues like get more access, easier access, maybe a little more better leadership or better more state or local activities around using data, and about a little bit more about attitude. And that tends to be, I see it's the highest one with rated 2, which is normal. I think there are a lot of negative feelings about data collection. And so we hope to help try to dispel those. All right, so let's move on about data quality. Now, data quality, of course, is really important. If you don't have good data, you're not going to be able to use your data. And it's going to give you, worse than that, it's going to give you misleading results. So I just would like you to look at this list of definitions of quality and what you think is good data, what is good quality. So if you could just type in the chat box, pick one or more of those and write down what you think is quality data. Just say, give you a few minutes to do that. What's quality? How do you know when something is high quality? So think about, like, for example, websites. What are high-quality websites? There's websites that might be usable. What about your home? What's a high-quality home? It might be safe, secure, comfortable. Your car, reliable car, easy to maintain. So things like that are what we're thinking about here. So we have a couple there: usable, maintainable, reliable, accurate, durable. Got a lot of reliability things there, yes, and that's definitely important. Accurate, reliable, usable. Okay, great. Quality data, accurate, relevant, stable, functional, usable. Right, it can, that's true. If you don't not using the data, well, you have it. So we want you to start using it. Usable, yes. Okay. Okay, so those are good. Thank you very much for that. Let me look at what we talk about in the in data, specifically about data that we think about quality. It must be objective to use data well. So in other words, unbiased, complete, it's not tainted in any way. It has an integrity. In other words, it's not falsified, doesn't have any made-up date numbers, it's not corrupted in any way. Transparent. Basically, we know how it's collected and who's collecting it. It's easy to understand and interpret. Reproducible, meaning that other people doing the same thing will get the same results. So poor data doesn't have that quality. And utility. A lot of you mentioned that as well. If it's got to be useful. If we're supposed to use it, we want it to be, and it's good quality. Part of that is makes it high quality. Here's a video now I'd like you to look at for the impact of poor quality.
Hi, this is just a quick real-life example of some of the problems that can result from data quality issues. It's a true story. This is Valparaiso, Indiana, and the red cross, the red square, is 1108 Chicago Street, the home of a Mr. Dennis Charnetsky. Now, he says his home is badly made and drafty. It's worth around $121,000. Early in 2005, however, somebody, they don't know who, went into the county's systems and accidentally changed the assessment value of his home to $400 million. Later in the year, a somewhat surprised Mr. Charnetsky received a property tax bill of a little over $8 million. He called, he asked if he could pay in installments, they laughed, corrected the figure and sent him a new bill for around $1,500. So far so good. Unfortunately, in the meantime, that $400 million figure had been used by all of the different cities in the county. In particular, it was used to determine the budget. The result was, at the end of the year, because Mr. Charnetsky hadn't paid his $8 million, they were left with a huge hole in the budget and had to implement emergency cost cuts. In particular, the school district had to return $2.7 million, which resulted in the elimination of all optional activities, including school trips, sports, new books for the libraries, everything. This resulted in some very grumpy children, some very grumpy parents, a general scandal, and resignation of the people responsible. There are two morals to this story. The first is that a single bad value can very easily get into different information systems. The second is that data quality can have real human consequences. So please, for the sake of the children, think about data quality in your next project.
Okay, so there's an example of what happens when you have bad data quality. I have another little story to tell you about that. I was in a meeting last week, I think, with the Department of Education, and there was an error on the data we were looking, but we didn't know, and the director was very upset as to why the data was so bad and what it meant, and we had planned a big analysis and actually to make a new training on people to show them how to correctly enter the data of this particular element. And a few hours later, the person, very embarrassed, who did the analysis said, you know what, I made a mistake and I put the wrong data in the wrong columns. And when he corrected it, there was no problem at all. So we almost went down a similar thing, a very costly path of doing a lot of data analysis that would have been expensive and planning a training around something we didn't need to do. So that's an example we just had last week here at the federal level. That reminds me of this. So let me ask you, how would a mistake like this look in your program? What problems could arise? And has this happened to you? So if you want to contribute, write it in the chat box, and what a mistake like this might be, or how, if it happened to you, what happened. Tell a little story about that. No one? Anyone want to comment on that? Okay, so Ken says promotional story in the newspaper is wrong, misinformation. Cynthia would be on it. ACAP. The data is very data-driven. Okay. Anything else on there? Angela is writing. Oh, students list today's date instead of birth date. Yeah, that's a common one, is birth dates. I've seen birth dates where the participants are 110 years old and things like that. So I can think of mistakes like enrollment or performance measures. Inviting the wrong people to HSC grad ceremony, yeah, that would be bad. All right. Okay, let me move on. So anyway, data quality, that's the idea. I'm wondering if what you all think of your data quality. It sounds like you're pretty confident in it. Let me bring a poll up, I believe, about that. So we'd like to know, it sounds like you think you're pretty good data. We'd like you just to make a guess or give your opinion. Is your data high quality? Yes. Some of it is, not sure, or no. So go ahead and click what you think. Okay, so we still have a few more responses coming in. I'll wait a second more. All right, so I think you can see that most people have 50%, 8 of you out of the 14 that voted think you have pretty good quality data. Yes, you do. And only one person not sure. So that's very good news for you. And I know your state is working very hard. Ken Zutter and Nancy Olson and the others are working very hard to have good quality data. Ken's replacement, I'm sure, will be doing that as well. So that's really good as we move on to our next section, because I'd like to talk now about using your own data for program improvement. Okay, so how do you do this? It's not an easy thing to do. It does require a little bit of training. I'm just going to give you a little bit of training right here, and it's easier than most people think, although it does take a little bit of effort and a little bit of thinking. Basically, I tell people when they ask me, well, how do we look at data? I sit down with them and say, well, what do you want to know? What do you want to know about your program? And then put it in the form of a question. And that takes a little bit of work because it has to be a question you can answer. So think about what it is you want to know and develop an answerable question around it that's specific. And then you can look at your data that answers that question. So it might be, are all of the different levels of EFL levels, students at different levels, are they performing and getting MSGs at the same rate? And so that you can look at your EFL breakdown by level, and you can answer that question. Then once you have that answer, you can discuss your findings with your staff, and then use your results for program improvement. And those are the 4 simple steps. And let me go back. Okay, what areas might you want to look at data? And I generally find 2 areas that I like to focus on because they're the most successful and the ones you can get data most easily, and we collect it in a pretty well reliable and valid way. And those are attendance measures and MSG, or mostly test score, pre and post test scores, although under WEO we've expanded that a little bit. So let me ask you, what questions can you answer about would you like to have answered about attendance and MSG? What do you think your data can provide to you? The data that you have, that you collect. Anyone? Just type it in the chat box. Okay, get some good questions there. Correlations between attendance, times of day, optimal numbers of weeks, pre and post percentages, class size, CASA scores aligning with MSG, with TABE rather, and NRS levels. Okay, so great questions, great things for researching, and great things that you might want to use your data to ask. Certainly things you can use to for program improvement. For example, if you're finding a relationship between attendance hours and MSGs, you can adjust your services perhaps, or the number of hours you provide. If you can find that optimal number for different types of students, and other things that you've mentioned. Typically, some attendance questions are students staying, and which type of students are staying, so retention is another issue you can study, looking at attendance hours. And here's some of the data. Somebody asked, what's the best way to look at and collect this? You could look at your contact hours, students getting, intensity and duration. So we could make a measure like how many hours per week, and what type of instruction is being provided. And that way you can look at, which materials are relevant, are working, the motivation of students, assuming that higher attendance means more motivation and more retention means more motivation, and maybe correlate with goals if you have data on student goals, whether they're being achieved and how many hours are needed for that. So attendance really can be a very powerful thing to look at and help you with program improvement. Then let's look at MSG now, basically pre and post testing scores, as well as whether people are getting high school equivalencies. Basically the questions you can ask there are your students learning? to look at Table 1, which is participant race and gender by EFL. So what you're able to look at there is those demographics. Table 2 has age, ethnicity, and gender, and 3 has program type and age. So I have an example of another state. This is not Nevada, and I don't know how well you can see that on your screen. But what this shows is educational functioning level and the ethnicity groups and whether they're male or female. So that's a very simple table, and what you can look at there is differences by gender and differences by race and ethnicity. So in looking at this table, I hope you can see it. I'd like to show you there that for one thing you can see there is that ABE and ASS student, in ABE and ASE, there are more male students, except for Asian, and then for ESL, there are more female students. And that's pretty common finding that women tend to take ESL classes more than men do, and men tend to be more in the ABE-ASE side. And so you might wonder, why is that? And that's a finding you can pretty consistently see. And what does that mean? I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that, but certainly that's a common finding. Another things you can look at Table 1 are differences by ethnicity. And not surprisingly, in this particular state, knowing what state it is, which is it's actually Florida, there's more Latino ESL students. You'll also see in Florida that most students are low level. So for ABE, most are in ABE levels 2 and 3, but yet for ESL they're higher levels, 3, 4, and 5. So that would be an interesting finding if you were the state and wanting to know why that was and how you wanted to reprogram if you wanted to maybe increase the levels of maybe lower level ESL students, which tend to be more in need. Why aren't they attending at the level you might expect them to? Want to point out, though, I don't know if you can see it, but and this is typically the case with smaller states in particular, is sometimes you have very small numbers. And when you have very small numbers, you shouldn't draw very close conclusions. Okay, so now what I'd like you to do is take a look at your own tables, Nevada 1, 2, and 3, Nevada's tables, and I believe you can get them in the handout box. Winnie, if you could help with that. When you look at each table, I want you to consider what are these data saying for you? What are they telling you and not telling you? What do you think it means? And notice particularly when you do data analysis, that's not the end. You usually have more questions than you started with. So what other information would you like to know to understand that? And did they suggest any changes? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to write up your observations and thoughts, and take a look at tables 1, 2, and 3, which you can access from the little box below, or you can look at them on the screen as well. I think we'll show them and put them up. And there's table 1 and 2, and if you scroll down, you can see 3 as well. So take a look and see, write a few suggestions, maybe one or two for each table, and write them down. And one thing you should, yeah, and then we'll talk about it. So if we can open up a chat box there and write that down, or maybe we'll just have a verbal discussion about it. But let me just give you a few minutes to look at those tables. If you can't see them on the screen, open them up, upload them, and read them. Might be easier to look at if you can look at them on your by yourself on your computer. And thank you for opening the chat box. So write down an observation or two about each table. Okay, I see several of you have noticed one of the main things we see in Nevada is we have 8,365 students. If you look at Table 1 at the bottom right, you see the total, and quite a large number of them are Latino, and if you look at Table 2, and Hispanic is Hispanic is our primary group. There's a lot of females. As I mentioned, there's a national trend that you see everywhere, that most ESL students are female, and you see that here in Nevada. There is, yes, Ken notices there's a large AB level 3, which is interesting, I guess. That's your biggest ABE population. Anything else? Yes, no one's enrolled in. You don't have very much. If you look at Table 3, IET or Section 243 programs, you don't have any at all. I imagine that's a new program and you haven't gotten started yet with it. IET is relatively new to many states, but you do have 182, which is probably a couple programs doing that. It's the first, Kansas is the first year of IET. And that's pretty typical in many states because it's a new thing under WIOA. And one thing that the department's pushing is to bring those numbers up. So you'll be seeing more about that from the federal level, sort of a policy initiative. Anything else? So yeah, how would we characterize Nevada? It's mostly Hispanic, female, 25 to 44. Mostly, and among the ABE population is mostly at the intermediate level. All right, so any reflections on that? Anyone want to comment on that? Yes, this is your most recent data that was just submitted. I think Ken was saying it's 16-17 data. You just turned this data in a few months ago, and it's what's being looked at right now at the federal level for each state. Okay, any surprises? Any what you expected? Any questions that maybe, one thing that if you really get into data, which is fun about it and gets exciting about it, is it raise a question like why is this happening? Perhaps what are the outcomes of ESL compared to ABE, since that's such a big part of your program? Which particular levels are performing better? So those are some questions that can come to mind. I don't know if anything strikes you, anyone looking at the data. Was this what you expected? Okay, Ken Zutter says, I'd like to compare male-female to previous years. Are males working now? One thing that struck me too is not too many people were in higher level ASC, levels 5 and 6. And I'd be curious to see, we'll be looking at Table 4 soon, how many high school equivalencies you're getting out of there. And that's on Table 4, which we'll be talking about next. Okay, just waiting for Ken and Nancy, who are busily typing right now. And please feel free to type or chime in if you have any of your any other comments. Ken saying we're seeing MSG gains from HSC and mid-ABE levels. Yeah, that's a trend we see in other states too, that people come from all levels when they get their high school equivalency. It doesn't have necessarily, or it isn't even very often in ABE in 5 and 6, which is where you'd expect it. And did an analysis once years ago where we found that students get high school equivalencies from just about every NRS level. Of course, mostly at the higher levels, but even people at level 1 will get high school equivalencies. And Ken's saying that it's nice to be able to get MSG from HSE now. Yeah, that's a new thing we added at the federal level, a new requirement to allow high school equivalencies to be counted as measurable skill gains, whereas before they were not. So helps a lot with the performance. Incidentally, I'll give you a little preview. The adult education looked very, very good this year on our performance on MSG compared to our partners. And I'm sure there's a lot of gloating going on at the Department of Ed right now about that. So good job to us, and particularly to you at the local level, helping our MSG look good at the federal level, which, as I started off the presentation today, is very important in these times of budget cutting and reduced resources available to us. It's really good to show that we are performing, and even in many cases better than our federal partners under WIOA. Not that we're in competition or anything, but that's the way it goes. Okay, let's go on. When you do look at data, remember to think about quality again. And if something doesn't seem right in data, a lot of times it's not, and you should definitely question that. One thing it's very good to be, if you're a data analyst, when you get into data, is to be skeptical, to always question what you're looking at. Because it's very easy to misinterpret data and or to see what you want to see in data. And it takes some, a little bit of objectivity and thinking to really look at data in a fair way, in a way that's really helpful. And certainly quality is something you should always think about. And particularly if you're at the local level, when you know how your program's collecting data, if you know of some anomalies and things you maybe aren't doing right, or things you could do better, you might be a little skeptical about it. And even all data, how is it being collected? And, you see polls a lot of times, for example, in the news, and that 80% of people think this and 60% of people think that. First question you should probably ask is the quality. Where's that number coming from, and is it really trustworthy? And it's always good to be a skeptic when it comes to data. You want to look at the averages and the ranges. A lot of people ignore variation, ignore ranges, in other words, what the high and the low number is. And you look at the average, but sometimes that can be misleading. So while it's important to look at the average, you want to look at the high and the low. And sometimes you can get some insight into that. And certainly, sometimes just looking at a number in isolation doesn't tell you very much. But when you look at it in comparison to a standard or to different groups, it will have more meaning. So if I just tell you, for example, I just said, we look good compared to our federal partners. I think our national performance is on MSG is around 44%. And if I just told you that, you wouldn't really know. You might have an opinion of whether that's good or bad. But then when you look at another provider, or if you look at labor, which is considerably lower, you'll say, oh, well, we're doing good compared to that. Or you might want to look with your local data. You might look at different programs or different EFL levels. And that's when we look at Table 4, you'll be able to see that. Okay, the next step is I'm going to conclude very quickly here, but I'd like you now to work on your own and do that in the next month or so. So I'm going to give you a little assignment. If you are going to the conference next month in Las Vegas, I'd like you to look at Table 4 for your program. And I have here in the handout the statewide Table 4 as an example. But what I'd like you to do if you are coming to the conference is, and even if you're not, you might want to do this just to get into the habit of looking at data. And as I said, that's really the key. One of the keys to using data is to do it with your colleagues and do it collaboratively, and just take a look at your data. Don't just enter it in the computer or collect it and forget about it. And that's sort of the key to using it and understanding it, because becomes like a negative cycle if you don't do it. If you don't look at your data, you don't use it, you don't value it. And if you don't value it, you don't collect it well, and it becomes poor quality, and then you can't use it. So it's like this vicious cycle. So by looking at your data, which is what we're hoping you'll do here, you might get more vested into it and look at it. And table 4 is our big table among our NRS tables because it has both attendance and MSG, and it's broken down by level. So you can really look at what's going on in your, particularly if you look at the local program level. So what I'd like you to do then is get your table 4 for your program, collaborate with your teachers, and next week when we do the teacher webinar, we'll be giving them the same assignment. So you might want to do that so you'll look at your program overall. So pick a topic, either look at your attendance or look at your MSG, or do both if you want, and come up with a question. As I said, I think good data analysis begins with a question, with what do you want to know, and putting it in the form of a question. For example, what gains are you making, your students making? Does it differ by student type? Does it differ by educational functioning level? And what are you seeing there? So look at the data and then try to make an interpretation. What is the data telling you, and what do you need to know? What would you like to know further? And the same with attendance. Like you came up with a lot of good suggestions earlier about looking at attendance and different ways to look at attendance. So take a look at Table 4. You can also look at attendance patterns and how they vary again by student type and student group. So here's Table 4, an excerpt of it. I don't know if we can show the whole table on there. We pretty much can. So just to get you familiar with Table 4, these are the different columns if you haven't looked at it before. It's broken down by the 6 ABE levels and the 6 ESL levels. And you have the number enrolled at each of the levels, and you'll see the total adds up to what we looked at the other tables as we're supposed to. You see you have 8,365 students last year in your state, in Nevada. And how many attendees are, rather hours of attendance do you have by level? And this is the total number of attendance. So if you divide that to column C and column B, it'll give you an idea of what the average attendance is. And then the other columns show the achievements by the different levels. So you have first one being the number who attained an EFL, at least one educational function level gain. Column E shows the number who got a high school equivalency. And then F is the number who separated before receiving a gain. Those are basically your students who left before they were post-tested, or they were post-tested and then they didn't show a gain, or they didn't get an HSE. Column G is the number who are retained in your program at the end of the year. Those are people still attending, but they haven't yet got a gain. And then in I, you have the percentage of MSG. So for example, let's look at level 3 ABE, which is your biggest ABE level. You saw about a 40% improved MSG. And your biggest one, I don't know if you can see yourself there, the group of students that's showing the biggest MSGs are ESL level 2, which is about a 58% gain. Then the remaining columns are periods of participation, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that now. You might look at that too, because what's interesting about periods of participation is those are students who left and came back 90 days or more later. And that was a new thing as you know, that we do for WIOA now. That was a new requirement. And by comparing that number, column I, with column B, which is number enrolled, you can see how many students came back of the same students. How many did return? And so, for example, if I pull again at your level 3, which is your biggest level in ABE, there were 852 participants and 864 periods of participation, which means you had only, 12 students come back after more than 90 days. And that's kind of a pattern we're seeing all over the country, is not that many students come back once they leave in a single year. And it's only averaging about 3 to 8% nationally. And I think it's pretty low here. I haven't calculated the overall percentage for you, but I'm imagining it's only in the single-digit percentages, 1 or 2, 3%. So that's something you can look at as well. And then J and K are the same, the additional MSGs that are achieved. So if you look at columns D and E, for let's say for ABE level 1, you'll see there are 30 gains and 4 high school diplomas, 30 EFL gains and 4 high school diplomas achieved. And that's 34 out of the 78, which translates to 43.59%, as you see in column H. But if we look at MSGs for those repeat students, which there were only 3, 81 in B in column I and 78 in column B, that went to 35. You can see the performance didn't really change any. So, and if we look at level K compared to level H, the percentages in those 2 columns, which is the last column K and H is 2 columns over, that compares participants with periods of participation. You can see there wasn't really very much difference in any of the levels. And if you look at the very bottom, the grand total, you'll see it was only in your state 42.1% MSGs for your whole state, for everybody, and doing it by individual participants, and doing it by POPs, it's 41.9. So it's pretty much the same. Very interesting for us at the federal level, since POPs, periods of participation, are a new thing. So as you can see, there's a lot of, I'm just trying to illustrate some things you can look at here. You can look at attendance hours, average attendance hours, and performance. A lot of things in Table 4 to look at. So please do work with your colleagues and write a question or 2 down, and just get some practice. And what I would like to do when we do our face-to-face in training in Las Vegas is ask you to report on that and see what your findings. And then not only just report on the findings, but try to go a step further and say, why do you think that is, and what other information you would like to get? Because, as I say, usually when you start doing data analysis, you end up with more questions than you started, or at least if you have a curiosity about data, you might want to then go to the next step, and it's like, well, why are students at level 3 doing so much better than at level 6, for example? And what are the areas? And also remember what I said about thinking about quality, and do you trust these data? That's always a question you should always ask when you look at data. So I think we're just about at our end here, a little bit early. So we have in your handout, you'll see the handout assignment bottom at the box there. So I've written down the assignment, so please look at that, and I hope you will do it, and I hope you will come to our face-to-face training next month. Remember, pick a topic, get a question, look at your data, be data analysts, tell me if you trust the data, tell me what else you'd like to know, and other data source you would like to do. And what would it mean for improving your program? So for example, if you find differences in one group not attending as well, if you find performance differences, what could you do about it? And we looked just now at the state level, statewide totals. So in your program, you might find a different pattern, and that might be another thing you might want to do too, is look at it compared to the state if you really want to move ahead. But right now, I'm just asking you to look at your own data. So it may be different, it may be the same as what you just saw at our state level.
Larry, there was a question that prompted some discussion on the right-hand side chat pod. Susan had asked, what's the difference between Table 4 and 4B? And then you could see there were a couple of responses, but I'm wondering if you want to describe that difference for Susan. And if you scroll the chat pod, you'll see some of the comments in relation to that. But how would you respond to Susan's question? What's the difference between Table 4 and 4B?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat pod, so... but Table 4B is only students that are post-tested. So if you have pre- and post-tested a participant, they go on 4B, whereas 4 is everybody, whether or not they were post-tested. So that's the difference between the two. And what you would probably see, you can certainly look at other tables. I just gave you a simple assignment, but if you'd like to do that and look at some other tables when you come next month, please do that. What you'll probably see in 4B, I don't have it in front of me for your state, that usually the performance is higher because you're only looking at people that are post-tested, participants that were post-tested. So if somebody is not post-tested, of course they can't show a gain. So you water it down. So 4B is just to look at post-test only. And Marianne, I don't see anything in my chat pod, so if there's another question.
I think if you, there's a few items. I'm scrolling for questions as well. And Larry, because you're a host, you'll see two tabs. One says everyone and one says hosts. So that might help you see that. Ken had responded, Table 4 performance includes high school equivalency MSG, which is not shown on 4B, as well as a few other comments. I don't know if
Right.
there's other questions.
4 has more data, of course. 4B is only for post-testing. It's only pre and post-testing. That's right. But really, I don't see anything in my chat pod. I don't know why.
Okay. Are there other, that's fine, I could scan for questions. Are there any other questions from the group? I see TMCC team is typing, as well as Ken. Words of thanks, Larry, from a couple of people. And we'll see if there's a question in there. TMCC says, I was unable to download the handout. Can that be sent? Yes, we can send whatever. We'll send to the group. Angela Holt is typing, as well as Winnie Barber. Thank you, Winnie. You'll send out the handouts. That's great. And Angela is maybe our last person typing. Thank you. You're welcome, Angela. And Larry, are there any concluding? I'm not seeing other questions. I don't know if there's other. There's still an opportunity. Any questions you have? Larry, any final comments? And I will point out, as I wrote in the chat pod, and hope everybody that you can see it. You're typing in the chat pod, so I assume that you are our guests can see it. The assignment is for the March 7th and 8th directors meeting. So we aren't having the conference, but we are still having the directors meeting. And I'm going to be sending out more information subsequent to this webinar. Larry, any concluding remarks? We are very grateful for your presentation today. It was excellent substance and content. We're looking forward to seeing you at the directors meeting for the follow-up to this. After today's session, I'm also going to send out a reminder that we do have the February 8th webinar that's going to be geared towards instructors and instructional leaders and using data for classroom practice. And Ken Zutter writes, agency data managers should attend teacher data webinar too, and Ariana agrees. So by all means, everyone, I think there's plenty of room in the February 8th webinar. Whoever you send, we are happy to include. So please don't hedge. You can send whoever you want to the February 8th webinar if you think that will be of benefit. And Larry, thank you. Do you have any concluding remarks for the group?
Thank you, Marianne. No, I just want to say I'm looking forward to seeing all of you, or those of you that can make it, next month to Las Vegas, and we will be. We're going to start our session by having you report on your Table 4 and any other data you want to bring in, and we'll have a discussion about what you're finding in your programs. And I'm available to help if you would like to talk further about this, if you want further resources. As I said, we've been doing this for many years, working with states and programs about using their data. And so if you are interested in more in depth, or I know there was a lot of content here, and if you want to talk about data or just help with your assignment, feel free to email me. I've also included Amanda's email, who's going to be doing the webinar next week. So it was really my pleasure to do this, and I really like doing this kind of work. So looking forward to seeing you all, whoever can make it next month. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry, and thanks to everyone. Look forward to chatting with you soon.
All right. Well, bye now.